In today's episode, we are speaking to Grant Williams. He is a creator of Things That Make You Go, and has really amassed one of the more popular financial newsletters out there in the world today. He was the co-founder of Real Vision as well, one of the premier platforms for online financial and investment education and insight. And so we're going to have a fantastic conversation today. So make sure you hit that like button on this video to send this out to the YouTube universe so more people see it. Quick shout out to our channel sponsor, which is Vizsla Silver. So thank you for being our silver mining stock sponsor, Vizsla Silver. Give us a comment down below and say Grant rules right there down below. And we'll dive right into this video. How you doing, Grant?
Mate, I'm great. It's good to see you.
Yeah, it's great to see you too. So, Rick Rule connected us. So thanks for doing that, Rick. And you're pretty well known for Things That Make You Go, And I wonder what is making you go, right now in the world, because there's a lot doing that for me.
How long you got? I mean,
I got funny. Like 6 days, right? You're in quarantine, so we have 8 days.
I'm in quarantine. Yeah, that's right.
We'll do a 96-hour podcast.
There you go. This, it's funny. I started that letter 10 years ago now, and bizarrely, over that entire time, to your point, that the things that are making me go home just seem to increase. I mean, I've not once in 10 years had nothing to write about. There's not one time in all that time where I've sat down and thought, what am I going to write about this week? It's always a case of, all right, well, what am I going to kind of cull to get down to the one thing I want to write about? And lately, I think it's a function of the kind of an acceleration towards the end game. I've got a podcast that I do with Bill Fleckenstein, who's a good friend of mine, and we called it the end game, really just by way of having a title and something we could use to frame the conversation. But as we've gone through that, and this kind of never-ending list of things that really are head-scratchingly bewildering in many cases, seems to be increasing as the world accelerates towards some sort of end game. And by the end game, I should be clear, we're not talking about the end of the world here. What we're talking about is a transition from the status quo, particularly with regards to the financial system, the monetary system of today, to whatever supersedes it when it reaches its end of life. And it just feels like we're getting closer to that. And the closer we get to it, the more things become disjointed and kind of fractured, and the more things there are to get curious about.
Speaking of your podcast, ENDGAME, you made the podcast and you guys explore many different angles, and everyone kind of shares their opinions. But what is your opinion on what this ENDGAME could look like?
Well, again, it's not an end; it's a transition, and as we've gone through this process, Bill and I, along with other podcasts I do with some other dear friends, Stephanie Pomboy and Ben Hunt, it's become apparent to me that the number one consideration right now is this debate ongoing about inflation. Is inflation coming back? Because if we get a resolution to that, then it will clear up an awful lot of things. If this is transitory, as the Federal Reserve insist on telling us it will be, if it's another false alarm, we've had many of them over the last couple of decades, then the end game is probably further away than one might expect otherwise. If the status quo continues, deflation continues, quantitative easing continues without blowing anything up, then there really isn't an end game. There's nothing to transition to. However, if we are at the point where deflation is coming to an end and inflation is going to gain the upper hand again, then I think the end game happens rather quickly, and I think it becomes incredibly painful for an awful lot of people, because the one thing the world really can't handle right now, by the world I mean the financial world, is a return of inflation. Because with inflation necessarily comes higher interest rates, and higher interest rates on a world that is literally drowning in debt cannot be allowed to take place. So we will have to see some very, very draconian measures implemented in order to keep the wheels in the system and stop interest rates from rising. And whether that is mandated holdings of treasuries in pension funds, whether it's yield curve control, who knows what it will be, but these steps will have to be taken to stop rates going higher, because higher interest rates from here will pop the debt bubble. And this is a super cycle debt bubble that's been building for half a century. So when it goes pop, it's going to be a very dramatic event that will create chaos through not just the financial system, but greater society as well.
Yeah, and that's kind of what you just summarized right there is really what led me to start this show. And as I'm 29, and having a 9-month-old daughter, I mean, if I was 80, I'd probably care a lot less. But yeah, being 29, I got quite a while to go here, trapped on this place. And one of the things that you hit on that I'd love to hear your thoughts more on is, you said the next kind of phase to see how this plays out is dependent upon inflation, whether it's transitory or not. And you said we've had many other false alarms. What is your take right now? I mean, certainly, even by the Fed's numbers, it's increased. I mean, it seems to me that really ordinary people that could care less about economics or the financial system, I feel like regardless of their political side, they're even noticing things are more expensive. How do you think this plays out? Do you think this is another false alarm, or do you think that inflation has real legs?
Well, I think you make a really important point there, Jake, for people to understand, and that is that there really is nobody that this doesn't affect. The only way you can categorize people are people that realize that and people who don't. And that's a very, very important thing to understand. So anybody who happens to have somehow stumbled across this conversation and doesn't really care about finance, doesn't really care about economics, this idea of inflation returning matters to them just as much as it matters to the people who kind of live and breathe this stuff, because it will change everything. And so as I've gone through this process of the podcast, I went into it, as I do everything, with a very open mind. I have my own views, I have my own preconceptions, but I don't hold on to any of them. I'm very, very willing to be dissuaded of them. If someone can come along and argue in a way that convinces me, I'm very open to being convinced. So I went into it with an open mind, and we've been fortunate to speak to a whole bunch of super smart people for whom I have just an inordinate amount of respect. And those people have come down on both sides. So it's not as though, there's one guy who I respect above all others who says inflation or deflation, and I blindly follow that person. It's not like that. We've had input from Lacey Hunt, who has been one of the kind of most vociferous proponents for deflation for the last 40 years. And he's been absolutely steadfast in that. And he's been absolutely right. There have been a few periods during that 40 years where inflation has seemed to be making a comeback, and Lacey has stood firm and said, nope, this is just a phase. And he's been right every single time. And we had Dave Rosenberg come on, who essentially made the same argument, slightly different reasoning behind it, but he too believes that inflation is transitory, it's going to come and go, and deflation maintains the upper hand. And both of them make very compelling arguments, and both of them could absolutely be right. On the other side of the ledger, we had Russell Napier, who is, again, has been a very staunch deflationist. But Russell has seen enough now to have him, for the first time in 20 years, step off that train and come out in favor of inflation being our future. And no matter where we went, no matter which conversations we had, whether it was with Bill or with Steph, I've found the same thing, this inflation deflation debate, just kind of pushing everything out of the way and muscling its way to the front of the discussion. And so I think it's something everybody has to have an opinion on, because, as I've said numerous times before, just about every portfolio in the world is currently set up to benefit from deflation, because that's what we've been experiencing all this time. If inflation returns, then your portfolio, I guarantee you, is not set up to handle that, and that could get very expensive. So as I've listened to everybody and I've weighed up all the opinions, I have found myself coming down on the side of inflation being the future. being, this I don't think is another false alarm. I've talked for the last several months. So I believe this to be the case, and the data is starting to bear that out. Of course, it's not baked in the cake. It still could be transitory, but I think there's an important point here, which is expectations around inflation, which are a big part of the whole puzzle. And inflationary expectations um, are increasing almost daily. So people are starting to notice higher prices, as you said. People are starting to act accordingly, and those higher prices, there is a great struggle on the part of manufacturing companies to be able to pass that on to consumers. And we've seen this through the last earnings season. A lot of the conference calls from CEOs, one of the main things they talked about was pricing pressures and their seeming inability to pass that on effectively to their consumers. So I think certainly over the longer term, and I'm not trying to invest in for the next week, I'm looking at trying to invest for the next 10, 20, 30 years. I think over the short, the medium to longer term, inflation has to be your base case. And if that's turns out to come true, then you have a lot of thinking, a lot of work to do in getting a portfolio set to deal with that effectively.
If you were in your 20s and you were trying to build a lot of wealth right now, and you knew everything that you knew, where would you be focusing? And I say in your 20s, types of 30s, because obviously, when someone's getting, older, maybe they're getting more conservative. But if you knew everything you knew and you were looking to make your fortune, where would you be focusing?
Well, look, I think the one thing to remember if you are in your 20s is you have the greatest advantage of all, which is time. And you have the luxury of being wrong. If you get this wrong, that's a real luxury. You still have time to make up for any kind of down years you may have in the short term. Now, you have to avoid at all costs the big drawdown. You have to avoid these 50, 60, 70% drawdowns, which happen from time to time, because those are a lot tougher to bounce back from it. And if you look at charts of all the main equity markets for the last 20, 30, 40 years, you'll see very steady progress. That, yes, we had the problems in 98, we had the problems in 2000, we had 2008, obviously. We've had a number of scares between 2008 and today, and we had last March. But markets have recovered. And so if you'd had the benefit of time and you were just investing steadily and averaging over those periods of time, you're fine. Had you been about to retire in 2009, for example, you had a major problem on your hands. If you were retiring in the middle of 2020, you had a major problem on your hands, because right before getting out, you had your portfolio cut in half. And so those are the problems that people need to be aware of. Now, if you're in your 20s and you're looking for 40 years down the track before you retire, then it's okay to use passive investing to benchmark the indices. The one caveat I would make everybody understand is that if you go back to the Great Depression, for example, you go back and see that equity markets lost 90% of their value, and they didn't regain their previous highs for 25 years. That's an entire investing lifetime for many people. So you have to be cognizant that when you get these major secular events, that they can do the kind of damage that can undo a lifetime of investing. So if you have money in the markets, you can't afford to not pay attention right now. There are periods when you can do that. The 90s, for example, the late 80s, early 90s, right through to the sort of mid 90s, was a very peaceful time to put your money to work in the markets and just let it ride. But things started to get very bubbly around the end of the 90s, and that it made it important for you to pay attention if you had money in the markets. Then after the crash in 2000, we had another 4 or 5 years where it was pretty plain sailing. There were plenty of tailwinds. But again, as we came into 2006, 2007, particularly in the housing market, the signs of a bubble were everywhere if you were paying attention. And if you were paying attention and you took the threat seriously, hopefully you would have done something to mitigate any potential damage from a bust of the housing market, which a lot of people did. And the same thing really now. The pandemic, really, there was no legislating for that. It came out of really nowhere, even though a pandemic was predictable. The timing of it, there was no signs to suggest what would happen. But if you look at markets now and look at valuations, how stretched they are, then it's pretty clear that you've got choices to make here, and they're pretty stark choices. You can decide that this party can go on for a lot longer, and valuations can remain stretched, and the good times are still here, which is absolutely fine. If that's the conclusion you come to after assessing all the factors in play, then that's absolutely fine. But I would suggest that the further you look back in history, the easier it is to understand that the times we're in now warrant an extreme amount of caution. Yes, you might miss out on some more gains, but the danger of being wrong here is elevated significantly and could potentially cause the kind of damage that people suffered in the 1930s. That's not to say we're going to have another Great Depression, but if the stock market gets cut in half, gets cut 60, 70%, given what's happening in the broader world, there is a great chance that it may take 20 years before the economy and the markets recover again. So again, all these things are important to be aware of, but outsourcing your thinking at any point in time is a very dangerous thing to do. Outsourcing your thinking today is incredibly dangerous. So I think it's incumbent upon everybody to pay attention, to understand the world, or try and understand it, to understand historical parallels and look at what happened in similar points in history, and then make calculated decisions. Don't leave things to chance right now, because I think that's a very, very dangerous thing to do.
Okay, so if we're talking about history, and looking at history more than even, how I focus only on commodities for my investing. And I think there's a great possibility that there's some tremendous upside, but I worry less about that and more about the social ramifications of what is happening. And so I look at the amount of people that can't pay their rent or their mortgage in America. I mean, it's incredible. My favorite restaurant, a nice restaurant, a high end restaurant in town, they've had plastic silverware, cups, and plates for months, and I always would say, look, friendly to the manager, look, I'm not coming in here and spending my money unless you get me some glass wine cups back, okay? And he would always say, like, next week. And I finally made a joke. I said, is there too much stimulus money going around? And he said, yeah. And I was surprised. I was making a joke. He can't even get anyone for the job, at a nice restaurant, not a crappy one. And he can't get anyone for the job. And so I look at that. And then if you look at history, when these monetary systems kind of fall apart, it's not an isolated phenomena to the stock market or to your bank account. There are social ramifications, and usually the fabric of society falls apart. And so I look at all of that, and having a 9-month-old and being in a country that has 350 million people that gets all its food from other countries. I look at all of this, and, to quote you, it's something that makes me go, And I wonder, what is your thoughts on the direction of society, and how do you think what is taking place, this kind of slow motion devaluation of currency and destruction of a lot of the middle class and lower middle class, how does this affect us going forward?
Well, look, not well is the simple answer, right? I mean, this is something that, look, it's happened before throughout history, and anyone that cares to look will see that these sorts of moves are always accompanied by tremendous societal turbulence. Read Bill Strauss and Neil Howe's book, The Fourth Turning, and everything you need to know is in there. So the thing that I struggle with is the the yawning wealth inequality is absolutely a function of monetary policy over the last 20 years. There is no argument about that, and it I don't know if it saddens me or sickens me to watch the Federal Reserve governors out talking about how they don't see any connection between monetary policy and wealth inequality. It's there for everybody to see, and there just is no question about that. So this has been a very deliberate policy to maintain stability in the financial system. It has enriched the rich beyond their wildest dreams, and the flip side of that, where it has made the poor even worse off, is a much slower moving train, unfortunately. So the rich have got very rich very quickly because of the astonishing rise in asset prices. But those less well off have become poorer slowly over time as this has kind of fed through in the system, and it's tragic to see. It's awful to watch, particularly if you are immersed in the financial system. Then I think you have a better understanding of how and why this is happening, and that's what makes it all the more distressing. Is that people who don't understand finance don't understand where their anger should be directed. And because of that, that anger gets directed to their neighbor or the guy who got the job that they wanted, or the guy who didn't get laid off when they got laid off. This frustration, this anger has been building for a while now. And, that's a big reason why all these stimulus checks are being thrown around, is to try and keep people, from causing even more social unrest at a time when not just America, but countries all around the world really can't handle that kind of unrest. So we are rapidly approaching some kind of reckoning. The policymakers would hope and expect that they can keep this thing together long enough for nature to heal itself and growth to return, all those good things. I think they're smoking crack, frankly. I just don't think there's any chance that's going to happen the way they think it's going to happen, which means that at some point the system is going to crack. Those in power are going to be held accountable. And, instead of a peaceful transition of power from the current system to whatever comes next, I suspect there is an increasing chance that that transition becomes a violent one, which nobody wants to see. But the longer they continue to try and maintain the status quo under the false premise that that will make sure everything's all right, the greater chance they create of there being a violent outcome, which is in nobody's best interest.
Yeah, it's so let me ask you, what do you first of all, how many countries have you been to?
I've been to.
Yeah, because you said you've
I've,
been traveling all over the world for so
yeah,
long.
I mean, I don't know. I mean, I've been to more countries than I can count. I've lived in 7 or 8, and I've traveled to dozens more. So I couldn't even begin to have a stab at that, but it's a lot.
So between all the interesting people you met in business over a long career, traveling all over the world, I'm sure you've developed some interesting philosophies. You've acquired some interesting mentors and people you've learned from. And when you look at the world as a large right now, and you look at this kind of deteriorating social fabric, and you look at the investment or economic landscapes, and if you were to think about, you have kids and you said you have grandkids, what do you think are the most important philosophies or thinking skills or mindsets, or whether it's for business or just general thinking skills? What would you say are most important for people to navigate these types of changes in the world successfully?
Well, there's several. Look, I think number one, it's incredibly important to listen more than you talk. I've always believed that. I don't think any of us learn anything from listening to ourselves talk. Whereas, you'll always learn something from, if you surround yourself with the right people, you're always going to learn something from it. So I think listening is something of a lost art in the age of social media, where everybody wants to be some kind of star, some kind of personality. I think the art of listening is dissipating, and I think that's a great shame. So number one would be listen more than you talk. and the higher you can get that, the higher you can get that ratio, I think the better. The second is history. All the answers to every question you have about today, about tomorrow, about human nature, about the likelihood for war, the likelihood for peace, the likelihood for the rise of communism, whatever it may be, every answer you need is in the history book somewhere. And so availing yourself of that and gaining a better understanding of history is incredibly important. And you'll be amazed if you just start trying to understand financial history, you will very quickly come to realize that all the major turning points outside finance, whether they be societal, whether they be world wars, whether they be cross-border conflicts, you will very quickly discover the link between finance to most of the conflict throughout history. They generally ultimately come down to money. Understanding the history of debt, the history of monetary standards, whether it be the gold standard, bimetallic standard, or pure fiat standard, the era we've been living under for the last 50 years, understanding the historical perspective on that will help you massively. And I think that lastly, and perhaps the most important thing, particularly today, and it causes me great sadness, is that you have to be able to engage with people that have opposing views to you. And to me, right now, there is nothing more important than to be able to look past somebody's political leanings, to look past their beliefs and engage with them. I did a podcast recently where I had a friend of mine called Peter Zion on. Peter's a geopolitical strategist, fantastic. He's a best-selling author, a fascinating man, and I've had the great good fortune to spend hours talking to over the years. And every time I've come away learning something about the world, which I didn't understand before, or having my perspective challenged. And we spoke, Peter, Bill, Fleckenstein, and I, for an hour and 20 odd minutes. And for 3 minutes of that hour and 20 odd minutes, prompted by a question that I'd asked Peter, and this wasn't him trying to shoehorn in some kind of political belief. He offered an answer to a question that involved him opining on the Republican Party and the MAGA and QAnon crowds. And it literally took up maybe 3 minutes of the hour and 20 minutes. And I was sadly not surprised, but saddened at how many people would email and say, well, this is disgraceful that, this guy, it completely invalidated everything else he said. And, when you think about that kind of attitude, and the truth is that comes up anytime you talk about politics and geopolitics today, that you encounter that reaction from people, which is why it didn't surprise me. It never ceases to sadden me, but it doesn't surprise me anymore. But if you think about it, what you're saying is, because this guy doesn't agree with my own political views, I find everything he has to say about things like the recent war between Azerbaijan and Armenia, for example, as worthless. I find his thoughts on China's potential strategy for Taiwan worthless. And if you just stop and think about that for a moment, it's such a ridiculous thing to do. It's such a ridiculous thing to cancel someone because of their political beliefs. That I just don't understand that kind of closed mindset. I don't necessarily agree with all Peter's political views, but I know that he's entitled to them, and I know to him they are worthy of his time, and therefore it's worthy of my listening to them. And if I disagree with them, that's okay. I can disagree with them and have my own views, and we can choose to disagree and just not engage on that topic. But I know that I take a tremendous amount of value from the rest of what he said, and I'd be a fool to ignore that based on a disagreement we have. But sadly, that is the reality in today's society, is that if you are a Republican, for the most part, not everybody obviously, but for the most part, if you're a Republican, you write somebody off who's a Democrat. And the same goes the other way around. It's the same in the UK with Conservatives and Labour. It's the same everywhere. And I think that polarization, which we see from left to right, is a huge problem for the world today, and it's being fueled by the mainstream media, who love to engage in picking a side. And look, let's face it, there is really no such thing as an unbiased news network these days. Everyone has a political angle. The closest I've seen to that is Al Jazeera, ironically enough, which I think does a tremendous job of presenting both sides of stories. I can hear the people's fingers on keyboards now. But this does such a great disservice to humankind in removing the ability to respectfully disagree with each other. That I think it's borderline criminal what's happening here. And the sooner we as a public find a way to look past the carefully created narratives that are designed to drive us further into one direction and away from the middle ground, the better off we'll all be. But unfortunately, with the influence of social media, I don't see that happening anytime soon, and I think it's a great tragedy for the world.
Yeah, it's amazing to watch, especially in America, where the three-letter agencies and the carefully crafted psychological organizations that are paid billions of dollars to engineer the world in this way. As someone who's, I'm very, I have been very apolitical, and I've just never bought into the red or blue side. And it's interesting to watch because I feel like, one, if you look at history, like you're saying, I mean, this is something that happens every time. You get everyone running around in the wrong direction, and I find it frustrating because, for the most part, like you said earlier, it comes down to what's happening financially, but our focus, the media puts us in all these things that really aren't that important. And
Yeah.
So it's frustrating to me, and that's one of the reasons I told you off air why I'm considering a move down to the Caymans, because of the social landscape of it. But let's bring it back up to, if we focus in on the financial component. I know you've had many conversations about this, which is I want to ask you about pensions and this type of Social Security landscape. Um, what is your view on that, and how do you see that playing out? Do you think it ends in another in retirement bailouts? How do you think that ends?
Well, look, again, the problem is well understood. Pension funds are dramatically underfunded. Not all of them, but in the aggregate, there's a tremendous underfunding problem with pensions, and that's a problem that can only really go away by somehow increasing the return that they can get, and that means higher interest rates for the most part, so their bond portfolios return more, or inflation, taking away in real terms what they have to pay back in nominal terms. So this is not a surprise to anybody, but oftentimes when you get these huge problems, and the pension problem is a huge problem, not just in America but elsewhere around the world, they're so big that people either don't want to think about them, or they assume that this is so big it'll get fixed. They'll have to fix this, right? The problem is with the pension situation, if they do have to fix it, it's a nightmare, because either they fix it by allowing the pension problem to manifest itself, in which case there are an awful lot of promises that are going to be broken, or they bail out the pension system, which means that once again the boomer generation, particularly, who are currently square in the crosshairs of this as they start to retire, to the tune of I think 50,000 boomers a day are retiring now. They once again receive the bailout, and the bill gets handed down the table to Gen Z and beyond. So again, it turns into a political hot potato. And again, I've spoken about this before, but the thing to watch out for, I think, if you're trying to figure out how this ends, is when we get the midterms, for example, in 18 months' time now, I guess, start to pay attention to how many young representatives start getting elected. Because right now, the problem is a problem faced by the boomer generation, and the boomer generation have by far the biggest representation in the corridors of power in Washington, D.C. So the lawmakers are making laws that are absolutely in their own best interest, i.e., let's protect the boomer generation because, you know what, I'm one of them and I stand to lose from this as well. We've seen this with the rise of AOC, and while I'm not remotely impressed with her as a politician, that she is the kind of spearhead of a movement towards a younger political class that is incredibly important to be paying attention to. And so you are, I suspect, going to start to see, there are 40-year-old millennials now. So you're going to start to see millennials voted in larger numbers into Washington, into the House, into the Senate. And that will change the dynamic dramatically because those people will, as all politicians do, be voting in their own self-interest, and they'll be listening to their cohort. So if you do start to see in the midterm, a sudden rush of early 40s, late 30-year-old representatives being elected, that tells you that things are going to change. Things are going to change dramatically, and the rationale behind votes is going to shift from protecting the boomers to penalizing the boomers in favor of the generations behind them who can't afford to get on the housing ladder, for example, who still live at home with mum and dad, who are struggling to make ends meet, while boomers are cashing out on what has been the single greatest lifetime in terms of wealth accumulation that the world has ever known. And look, that's not the boomers' fault. They happen to be born at the right time, right? It's pure fluke on their part, and they have made out like bandits. And good luck to them. But there comes a point where they have amassed so much wealth now at the expense of others that as the torch gets passed, there's only one place for the people without that wealth to go get it from, and that's the boomer generation. And that's going to be in the form of either allowing pension promises to be broken. It's going to be wealth tax. It's going to be real estate tax. It's going to be tax on all the assets that the boomer generation have accumulated over the years. And the hope is that this is done sensibly and fairly, and it's not done in a pejorative way. It's not done by demonizing the boomer generation and making pariahs of them and stealing everything you can from the boomer generation. But one can hope that it's done in such a way that it's, look, you have to appreciate here that you have had it so good, but it's been at the expense of future generations. So how do we sit around a table and how do we come up with a solution to this that means that you guys chip in some more? We don't want to put you on the street, but how are you going to contribute to making things fairer for the generations that follow? That would be the hope. The chance of it happening peacefully like that and over a cup of tea and a few biscuits is virtually zero. So that's what I think awaits us, and it's going to be particularly painful for everybody to watch this play out because grandkids are going to be pitted against grandparents, and Gen Xers like me who've been caught in the middle of this for our entire lives will just kind of sit there watching the bullets fly over our heads, trying to figure it all out. But look, I don't think this happens peacefully and calmly. I think it will be a fight, and it's not going to be a pleasant one to watch unfold.
Do you think that I'm overreacting by thinking that that there are places that might be safer to raise a family than America, given the fourth turning, given the majority of these things that we've discussed? Do you think that I'm overreacting by what I'm feeling?
Look, it's a very interesting question, Jake, because let's talk about the idea of overreacting, right? You're talking about a set of problems which you've identified. At that point, it becomes a question of how do I handicap the chance that these problems become not just a broad problem, but a problem to me? And so that's an exercise you have to go through personally, and we all have to go through that. And so if you decide that this represents a material threat to my family, for whether it's our well-being, our ability to get a job, or our personal safety, if you weigh up the pros and cons and you come down on that, of course, there's no way you can overreact. This is what you determine to be a real threat. And so you should take steps to mitigate that. Other people will judge and say you're overreacting, but that purely comes from their own weighing up of the same criteria and their decision that it doesn't represent a present danger to them. So, this idea that, oh, you're overreacting, I find that as foolish, because it's you're taking your own judgments about something and then kind of projecting those onto someone else's reality, and that's a foolish thing to do. So, look, if someone breaks into your house, are you overreacting in America buying a gun and learning to shoot and keeping a gun under your bed? Clearly you're not, because you don't feel safe otherwise. But other people might say, oh, that's a massive overreaction, just get an alarm. You have to do what makes you feel safe. So this idea of overreacting, I think, is something that it's way too easy to generalize it. I think right now the world faces a set of problems which, while not unique, don't happen that often throughout history. On average, again, going back to the full turning, every 80 or 100 years. But when they do happen, they're material and they change billions of people's lives. So I don't think it's possible to overreact about that. I think it's very possible to underreact. And by that, I mean to not either pay enough attention or spend enough time thinking about the potential outcomes. I think that's eminently possible. But I think if you understand what's going on, you weigh up the potential for those circumstances to cause you and your family immediate problems, and you take the steps you believe are necessary to mitigate those, I don't think anybody can call that overreacting.
Interesting. Fair enough. So I thought that would be an interesting question to ask you. So as I know you're a busy guy, we've had a very interesting conversation. I kind of like to wrap up by asking you. You have grandchildren. What are the most important things you want to teach them?
Well, geez, just calm down every few minutes, because I'm an old man now. It's probably the most important one. My youngest granddaughter is like 10 weeks old, so it's going to be a while before I can teach her anything. And my eldest grandchild is 2, so she's teaching.
Oh wow, they're
me
both
more than
young.
I'm teaching her at the moment. But look, I think it's important to try and teach your kids things. It gets harder to teach grandchildren things because they're being taught things by the parents, and it's a territory fraught with danger to step on those toes and try and decide what you think your grandkids should be taught. But with my kids, I've always tried to teach them independence. I've tried to teach them to think for themselves. I've tried to teach them that life isn't fair, and I think that's a very important lesson.
Why do you think that's an important one?
Because we live in an era where great pains are taken to try and make everything fair for everybody. And whilst it's a noble cause, I think it's pretty simple to agree that it's impossible. We can't make the world fair. It's not a fair place. Either we all get cancer or none of us get cancer. I mean, in a simplest term. So how can it be fair? And so whilst it's noble to try and give people the best shot you can, what that seems to have morphed into is a desire to make everything fair and to punish people in the pursuit of that fairness. And I think that's a very dangerous slope to go down. This woke movement is, I think, becoming quite problematic. It started out with noble causes, but cancel culture and the way there are just huge pile-ons with anyone who has an opinion now that doesn't fit the opinion du jour is a very dangerous thing. And it comes back to this idea of how do you decide what's a fair opinion to have and an unfair opinion to have. Now, we can all think of things that are heinous for us to even contemplate. Some views that people have are obviously unjustifiable. But when did we rely on governments to stop us from recognizing that those thoughts are unjustifiable, those views are unjustifiable, and just ignoring that person? When did it have to be a government mandate that, you cannot tolerate this person's views? Anytime I listen to someone who I think is saying outrageous things or is prejudiced or bigoted, I just ignore them. I see them for what they are. I don't engage with them. I mentally write them off, and that's it. But we now live in a world, it seems, where if I don't actively come out and and vocalize my disgust at what they might say, I'm somehow doing something wrong. And I think that's a great shame. I think, this idea of free speech, people should be given the latitude to make complete fools of themselves by voicing opinions which are ludicrous. Not try for us to. It's not incumbent upon us to try and create a safe space for everybody, so that nobody has a right to not be offended. And I'm a great believer that offense is taken for the most part and not given. And so, if I say something in any of my podcasts, look, you know as well as I do, when you do a podcast, you are out there talking spontaneously off the cuff and talking about ideas and sharing ideas and thoughts as they come to you. And if some of those thoughts upset or offend people, well, anyone that knows me or knows my work, they know that I'm not setting out to offend people. I'm not Alex Jones. I'm not trying to create anger and divisiveness and polarize people. So if you choose to take offense from someone, but you know that that person is not someone who sets out to try and cause offense, it's okay to let it go and say, you know what, I didn't really like that, but he's not some heinous guy. He's not out to be an evil influence on the world. I'm going to let it go. And we've gotten away from that. And people are pilloried for slips of the tongue, and judgments are made about their characters over, a word or a group of words they might say, off the top of their head. And I think that's a tremendous backward step for society. It should be okay to make a mistake. It should be okay to apologize for something and have it forgotten and move on. But nowadays that seems to be impossible. So I try and teach my kids all those things, that it's okay to be offended. You don't have a right to not be offended, but you choose how you handle that offense, and you choose how you engage with the people that offend you. And I think dialogue is better than divisiveness. And if you can engage people in a dialogue and understand your differences, I think it goes much further than it does to completely cancel someone and say, look, this person doesn't hold views that I agree with, so I'm gonna completely cancel them. I just think it's a great shame for society that we're going that way.
Now, does this exist in the Cayman Islands?
Look, it exists everywhere. I think it's a great shame, but everybody now is on their toes about everything they say. You worry now about, oh my God, did I say something that someone's going to take offense to? And I find that a true tragedy. It's okay that people could say something that you could take offense to. It's okay that you might live your life and go through it and be offended every now and again. It's okay. It's not going to kill you. Shake it off. And unless that person is trying to cause offense, then give people some leeway.
Do you have the same type of political chaos is probably the wrong word, but do you have the same type of intense political divisiveness in the Caymans as we're seeing in America?
Look, there's 60,000 people here, so you're not going to get that kind of angst. There's not enough money in it to stir it up for a start for people that might want to do that. Cayman's politics are the same as politics everywhere else in the world. There are people who have power. There are people who want power. Everybody has a line which they'll cross and which they won't cross, and the game of politics is the same everywhere in the world. I mean, it doesn't get the coverage here it gets everywhere else, so you don't really see it. But I can promise you one thing, and I don't know enough about Cayman politics to comment on it from any position of strength, but I'm pretty comfortable in saying that Cayman politics are the same in nature as politics in every other country in the world.
Very interesting. Grant, I really appreciate you coming on and philosophizing with us today. I'm for everyone listening, I'm going to put Grant's website right there down below. Sign up to his newsletter, which is right there down below. I'll link his Twitter right there down below as well. So please go ahead, give him a shout on Twitter, head over to his website, sign up. He's got quite a few, actually. You're kind of like the juggling podcast guy. You got quite a few different podcasts. So we'll link all those. He's got Endgame. He's got things that make you go, So if you're a podcast connoisseur, lots of options. Make sure you hit the like button on this video or this side to send it out into the YouTube universe. Give us a comment down below and let us know if you enjoyed having Grant on. And I really appreciate you coming on and talking with me for a little while, Grant.
It's been a pleasure, Jake. Good to see you.